The Senate Judiciary Committee chamber had grown heavy with silence. Every seat was filled, the air thick with anticipation as the cameras rolled and aides shuffled papers with nervous precision. At the center of the tension stood Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who rose from his chair and approached the microphone with his trademark composure. His face, carved by decades of political warfare, betrayed little emotion. Adjusting his glasses, he began to speak. "Mr. Chairman," he said evenly, "this nomination represents one of the most concerning decisions ever put before this committee." He was referring, of course, to the White House's selection of Representative Jasmine Crockett to lead the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, a choice that had ignited both praise and protest across Washington. McConnell's tone was measured, but his words were edged with disdain. He declared that Crockett's career reflected not an impartial public servant, but, in his words, an activist determined to advance a divisive agenda under the guise of law enforcement. As he spoke, the C-SPAN cameras panned slowly across the room, capturing the uneasy expressions of several Democratic senators. Some shifted in their seats. Others stared straight ahead, waiting for Crockett's turn to respond. McConnell continued, each sentence delivered with surgical precision. "This is not about qualifications," he said, "but about temperament and intent. The Civil Rights Division is not a platform for political activism. It is an institution meant to uphold the law without prejudice." Representative Crockett's public remarks, her litigation history, and her policy priorities all suggest an alarming distrust of the very institutions she would be tasked to oversee. He paused to sip water, letting the words hang heavy in the air. Then, in a deliberate gesture, he lifted a thick folder from the desk in front of him. "Before my colleagues cast their votes," McConnell said, "I urge them to review this document I've entered into the record, a comprehensive analysis outlining the most troubling aspects of Representative Crockett's record. I am confident that upon review, even members of the opposite party will see why this nomination should not move forward." He returned to his seat slowly, his face unreadable, but his confidence evident. Across the chamber, Chairman Dick Durbin leaned toward the microphone. "Thank you, Senator McConnell," he said, turning toward the witness table. "Representative Crockett, you may respond." The cameras pivoted. Jasmine Crockett sat poised and composed, her royal blue suit sharp under the bright overhead lights. She adjusted the microphone slightly and folded her hands. Those who knew her recognized that expression. Not anger, not defensiveness, but calm focus. It was the look of a woman who had argued before tough judges, faced down hostile opponents, and always come prepared. No one yet realized that the hearing was about to take an unexpected turn. For nearly 2 decades, Mitch McConnell had commanded the Senate floor like a chessboard. At 82, his slow, deliberate cadence and stoic demeanor had earned him the nickname the Tortoise, a moniker that captured both his patience and persistence. He had perfected the art of obstruction, using rules, procedure, and message discipline to block Democratic initiatives one by one. And this fight, he believed, would be no different. To McConnell, this was not merely about one nominee, it was about control. He viewed the Civil Rights Division as one of the most strategically significant offices in the federal government. Its power to enforce voting rights, investigate discrimination, and influence policing practices made it a potent tool in shaping the nation's social fabric. A strong, reform-minded leader could alter the balance of power across states and institutions. And Mitch McConnell had no intention of letting that happen. Jasmine Crockett represented everything that unsettled him. At 42, the 2-term Congresswoman from Texas had risen quickly through the ranks, propelled by a reputation for sharp legal reasoning and moral conviction. Before entering politics, she had spent years as a civil rights attorney, fighting cases across the South. Voting rights violations, police misconduct, housing discrimination. She had not only won landmark judgments, but had also built a reputation for integrity and fearlessness. Civil rights groups hailed her nomination as a turning point. Here at last was someone who understood the Civil Rights Division's mission, not as an abstract legal concept, but as lived reality. She had represented families denied housing, workers facing racial bias, and citizens stripped of their right to vote. To her supporters, she was the embodiment of what the department needed, experience grounded in justice rather than politics. But to McConnell, she was a threat, a capable, articulate, and unflinching advocate who could revive the very civil rights enforcement he had spent years tempering. Behind the scenes, McConnell's team had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Make an example of her, he had reportedly told his staff, according to later reports from the Washington Post. Find every controversial remark, every overreach. Show the Senate what happens when ideology overtakes law. What resulted was a 68-page dossier titled The Radical Record of Jasmine Crockett, a meticulously curated compilation of her public statements, case history, and speeches, stripped of context and framed to suggest extremism. It was opposition research, sharpened for maximum impact. What McConnell did not anticipate was that Jasmine Crockett had anticipated him. She knew the playbook. She had watched countless nominees walk into hearings like this, only to be trapped by their own caution, backpedaling, apologizing, trying to appear reasonable. Crockett had no intention of following that script. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice calm and measured. "And thank you, Senator McConnell, for your remarks and for your concerns regarding my record. I appreciate the opportunity to address them directly." McConnell looked up, expecting the usual nervous deference. Instead, Crockett's tone remained steady, even composed. She reached into the folder before her and pulled out a document of her own. "I've reviewed the Senator's 68-page report," she said, "and I've prepared a response which I'll be submitting for the record, not to deny my positions but to provide the context his document omits." Murmurs rippled across the chamber. McConnell's eyebrows lifted slightly. This was not the defensive posture he had expected. Crockett continued. "The Senator references my criticism of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder as evidence of radicalism. What his document doesn't include is that my criticism echoed the reasoning of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent, which compared that decision to throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. My view wasn't radical, it was legal. Alignment with a respected judicial argument." Several Democratic senators nodded subtly, recognizing the reference. Even a few Republicans appeared to shift uncomfortably. Crockett had reframed the accusation as adherence to established legal reasoning rather than ideology. She continued, methodically dismantling McConnell's claims. "The report cites my lawsuit against the Dallas Police Department as proof of anti-law enforcement bias," she said. "What it doesn't note is that this case resulted in reforms that reduced both civilian complaints and officer injuries by more than 40% over 5 years. Those outcomes were recognized by the department's own leadership." Her delivery was calm, factual, surgical. Instead of emotional rebuttal, she offered evidence, numbers, results, endorsements. The effect was undeniable. Across the dais, Senator John Tester nodded thoughtfully. Senator Kyrsten Sinema took notes, her expression unreadable but attentive. McConnell's confident smirk began to fade. Crockett leaned slightly forward, her voice steady but resolute. "Senator McConnell describes my work as radical activism rather than legitimate legal advocacy. I believe that reflects a misunderstanding of civil rights law. When I represented a black family denied housing in violation of the Fair Housing Act, was enforcing their rights radical activism or simply the practice of law?" The room fell silent. The question hung there, unanswerable, without conceding her point. For a moment, McConnell said nothing. Crockett didn't press. She didn't need to. She turned another page. "The Senator also cites my comments describing certain voting restrictions as designed to suppress minority voters, labeling them inflammatory. What his document omits is that this exact phrasing comes directly from a federal court, ruling in the case I referenced, a decision later upheld by a conservative Fifth Circuit panel." A visible shift spread across the committee dais. Senator Amy Klobuchar leaned toward Cory Booker, showing him something on her phone. Almost certainly the ruling Crockett had cited. Facts, context, and composure were dismantling weeks of McConnell's preparation. Then came the moment that changed everything. "The Senator's report questions my temperament," Crockett said. "It includes examples of my assertive conduct in court as evidence of partisanship. For the record, I am submitting letters from opposing counsel in those very cases, including 3 Republican-appointed U.S. attorneys attesting to my professionalism and integrity." She held the letters up briefly before passing them to the clerk. The effect was immediate. Even Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican moderate, leaned forward to review the documents closely. In a single stroke, Crockett had transformed McConnell's narrative from accusation to vindication. By the time she finished her initial statement, the atmosphere in the room had changed entirely. The woman McConnell had tried to portray as reckless and radical had instead demonstrated calm authority, preparation, and command of fact. For the first time, McConnell's confidence seemed to waver. He leaned toward his counsel, whispering, eyes narrowing slightly. Chairman Durbin announced that the questioning phase would begin. McConnell unusually asked to go first. He knew the hearing was slipping away and intended to seize control again. Representative Crockett, he began, his tone sharper now. You've offered a detailed defense of your record. Let me ask directly. Last year you stated that the Supreme Court's ruling in Brnovich v. DNC effectively gutted the Voting Rights Act. Do you still stand by that statement? It was a tactical question, framed to force Crockett into either reaffirming her critique of the court or retreating under pressure. She took a slow breath, glanced briefly at her notes, and looked directly at him. Senator, I appreciate that question. The Brnovich decision did, in my view, significantly narrow Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act by adding new factors not found in the statute's text. Justice Kagan's dissent, which I found persuasive, described the majority's reasoning as inhabiting a law-free zone. My analysis is rooted in that legal interpretation. Her tone was measured, analytical, more like a lecture in constitutional law than a political defense. The distinction was clear. She wasn't making a political statement. She was offering a professional legal opinion. McConnell pressed further. So you still believe the court gutted the law despite Section 2 remaining intact? Crockett paused. Then she made her move. Senator, what matters most is not my personal phrasing of the decision, but how I would implement it as head of the Civil Rights Division. The Supreme Court's interpretation, whether I agree with it or not, would guide my enforcement decisions. Throughout my career, I have operated within binding precedent, while advocating for fairness under the law. That's how I would serve in this role. It was a masterstroke. In one response, she showed respect for judicial authority, while defending her integrity as a lawyer. Even the moderate senators across the aisle seemed visibly impressed. Senator Murkowski nodded slightly. McConnell's line of attack was losing traction. He leaned forward again, voice lower but edged. Your record, Representative, shows a pattern of pushing arguments beyond established precedent. Why should we believe you'll suddenly become restrained in this position? Crockett allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. Senator, she said calmly, as a trial lawyer, my duty was to advocate vigorously for my clients. That means testing precedent when appropriate, something permitted and in fact encouraged under Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. But the role I've been nominated for is different. As head of the Civil Rights Division, my obligation is to enforce the law as written, not to expand it. My record shows I respect that distinction. In 12 years of practice, I have never had a court sanction me for frivolous arguments, and judges across the political spectrum have commended the integrity of my advocacy. McConnell said nothing. The silence spoke louder than words. Across the dais, several senators exchanged knowing glances. Crockett had dismantled his question piece by piece with law, not politics. When McConnell finally spoke again, his tone was subdued. One last question, he said, attempting a final pivot. Your nomination has been endorsed by groups that have called to defund the police and taken positions many Americans find extreme. How could you lead a division that must work closely with law enforcement if you share their views? It was his final attempt to frame her as radical, to paint her allies as her own ideology. Crockett reached into her folder once more and lifted a new document. Senator, I'm glad you asked, she said, her tone still calm but firm. I have here a letter endorsing my nomination, signed by the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, the Hispanic American Police Command Officers Association, and 37 current and former police chiefs and sheriffs from across the country. McConnell blinked. The room went still. These law enforcement leaders support me, Crockett continued, because they've worked with me. They've seen that accountability and public safety are not opposites. They are complementary. I have never supported defunding the police. I have supported constitutional policing that protects both officers and communities. That's the approach I'll take as head of the Civil Rights Division. She handed the letter to the clerk. The camera zoomed in on McConnell's face, still composed but his jaw tightened slightly. "Thank you, Representative Crockett," he said after a pause. "I have no further questions." And for the first time in years, the Senate Minority Leader yielded his time early. The tension that had defined the first half of the hearing seemed to dissolve as Mitch McConnell yielded his time. For a moment, the room was eerily quiet. No rustling of papers, no murmuring aides, only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the relentless click of camera shutters. Then Chairman Durbin leaned forward. "Thank you, Senator McConnell. Senator Booker, you're recognized." Cory Booker smiled faintly, glancing toward Jasmine Crockett. "Representative Crockett, I just want to start by saying something that might not get said enough in this room. Thank you for showing what calm strength looks like." A few members chuckled softly. The ice had broken. Crockett inclined her head politely. Booker continued, turning the moment serious again. "You've spent your career enforcing civil rights statutes written in a very different America. Could you tell us what equal protection under the law should mean in the 21st century? Crockett clasped her hands. "Senator, equal protection must evolve with our understanding of fairness. The 14th Amendment doesn't freeze justice in 1868. It charges each generation to interpret equality within its own context. Today that means ensuring that new technologies, economic structures, and policing methods don't replicate old injustices in modern forms." Booker nodded. "Well said." His time expired, but the tone of the hearing had changed for good. Behind McConnell's blank expression, irritation simmered. He had lost control of the narrative. His aides, seated 2 rows behind, frantically exchanged notes. The hearing was supposed to paint Crockett as reckless. Instead, she had come across as composed, principled, and unflinchingly professional. When Senator Lindsey Graham took his turn, the minority leader's hope flickered again. Graham was often the sharpest interrogator on the Republican side. "Representative Crockett," Graham began, his southern drawl smooth but pointed. "I respect your record, but many Americans worry that civil rights enforcement has become political weaponry. How can they trust you won't use your position to punish states whose laws you personally disagree with?" Crockett leaned slightly toward the microphone. "Senator, I understand that concern. Enforcement cannot be about politics. It must be about measurable violations of law. Every case I've ever brought has been grounded in statutory text and precedent. The rule I'll follow is simple. If the facts show a violation, we act. If they don't, we don't. My personal opinions don't dictate outcomes, the evidence does." Her delivery was crisp, confident. Even Graham gave a brief nod before pivoting. "And if the president calls you, hinting at what cases to prioritize?" Crockett didn't hesitate. "Then I would remind the president that the Justice Department's independence is not optional. It's constitutional tradition." A murmur of approval spread across the Democratic side. Graham ended with a half smile. "Fair enough, Representative. I may not agree with everything you've done, but I respect a straight answer." McConnell scribbled something on a notepad but didn't look up. In the marble hallways outside the chamber, reporters huddled around glowing laptops. Headlines were already being drafted. Crockett dismantles McConnell's case in Senate showdown. Nominee turns GOP, offensive into lesson on constitutional law. Cable networks cut between live footage and panels of analysts. Conservative commentators admitted somewhat begrudgingly that Crockett had been well prepared. Progressive commentators called her the calmest person in Washington today. Inside, the hearing continued for hours. Senator Klobuchar asked about voting rights modernization. Senator Murkowski pressed Crockett on cross-state cooperation. Each answer reinforced the same impression: competence, not confrontation. By late afternoon, when Chairman Durbin finally banged his gavel to adjourn, exhaustion hung over the room. McConnell gathered his papers without a word. As Crockett stood to leave, a young staffer whispered, "You just made history." She didn't smile. She simply nodded and said, "I just told the truth." The following morning, Washington, D.C. awoke to a storm of reaction. Every major paper carried the story on its front page. The Washington Post, "Composure over combat. Crockett neutralizes Senate opposition." The Wall Street Journal, "Nominees poise shifts hearing dynamics." Even Fox News conceded, "Unexpected calm from Crockett leaves GOP strategists reassessing approach." In McConnell's office, the atmosphere was tense. Senior advisors pored over polling data showing that public opinion had tilted sharply in Crockett's favor. Aides proposed releasing excerpts from the dossier to conservative outlets, but McConnell rejected the idea. "We'll look petty," he muttered. "The damage is done." Privately, colleagues began to question his tactics. Senator Susan Collins was overheard telling a reporter that the minority leader underestimated her. Within 48 hours, 3 moderate Republicans announced they were open to supporting Crockett's nomination. Meanwhile, Crockett returned to her Texas district briefly before the final committee vote. She was greeted by crowds at the airport, supporters holding signs reading "Justice Needs Courage" and "Crockett for Civil Rights." She smiled humbly, waving once before disappearing into a waiting car. Her staff insisted she was focused on work, not applause. A week later, the Judiciary Committee reconvened to vote. The dais was quieter than usual, the tension replaced by inevitability. When the clerk called the roll, the tally came quickly. To yes, 10 nays. Crockett's nomination advanced to the full Senate. Chairman Durbin congratulated her with a handshake. Cameras caught McConnell's brief glance downward as the gavel struck. His aides whispered, "We can still stop it on the floor." He didn't answer. That evening, political programs dissected the result. Analysts called it a masterclass in preparation. One host on PBS remarked, "She answered every attack with law, not rhetoric. That's what made it unassailable." The full Senate debate 2 weeks later drew near-record viewership. The chamber looked almost ceremonial. The mahogany desks polished, the marble gleaming under spotlights. McConnell rose once more to deliver his final argument against confirmation. His tone was subdued, his phrasing careful. "This is not about Representative Crockett's intelligence or decorum," he said. "It's about preserving the nonpartisan integrity of the Justice Department." But the words felt hollow. Even he seemed unconvinced. When he sat down, several senators avoided meeting his eyes. Then Majority Leader Chuck Schumer rose. "Colleagues," he said, "we just witnessed one of the most thorough and dignified confirmation hearings in recent memory." Representative Crockett faced hours of scrutiny and responded with grace and substance. "If that's not integrity, I don't know what is." The vote was called the next afternoon. As the clerk read the roll, the chamber held its breath. Baldwin, aye. Barrasso, no. Booker, aye. Collins, aye. Gasps. Vote Republican yes vote this early signaled momentum. When the final tally appeared, on the board 58-42, the Senate erupted. In a rare round of applause, Jasmine Crockett had been confirmed as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. From the visitor gallery, her mother wept quietly. Crockett, seated on the floor below, simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Let's get to work." Later that night, long after reporters had left, McConnell sat alone in his office overlooking Constitution Avenue. The lights of the Capitol dome glowed faintly through the blinds. On his desk lay the same dossier he had once brandished so confidently. Slowly, he flipped through the pages, realizing how little of it mattered now. He wasn't accustomed to losing battles so publicly. Yet part of him, somewhere deep beneath the calculation, felt a grudging respect. Crockett hadn't beaten him with outrage. She had beaten him with preparation and restraint, the very tools he once prided himself on. He closed the folder, muttering to himself, "She's going to be a problem for a long time." Outside, the city buzzed with late-night traffic and camera crews still filming live reports. Washington was already rewriting the story. Crockett's calm triumph marked shift in Senate power dynamics. 3 weeks later, Jasmine Crockett walked into the Robert F. Kennedy Justice Building for her first day as head of the Civil Rights Division. The brass doors reflected the morning light as she paused to look up at the engraving above the entrance. "The place of justice is a hallowed place." Inside, staffers greeted her with cautious enthusiasm. Some had served under 5 different administrations. All were veterans of policy storms. She gathered them in the main conference room and spoke plainly. "I know the politics outside these walls are noisy," she said, "but our job is quiet, deliberate, and sacred. We protect rights. We enforce the law. We don't chase headlines, we create fairness." No applause followed, just solemn nods. It was exactly the tone she wanted. Over the following months, Crockett's leadership began to reshape the division's approach. She prioritized data-driven enforcement, transparency, and cooperative reform with local agencies. Her first major initiative, a joint federal-state task force on housing discrimination, won bipartisan praise. Editorials that had once doubted her impartiality now lauded her effectiveness. USA Today. Results over rhetoric. Crockett's civil rights. Agenda finds common ground. Even some of McConnell's allies admitted privately that opposing her had been a miscalculation. In congressional hearings months later, she remained the same, measured, respectful, prepared. When asked about her confirmation battle, she would only smile slightly and say, "I learned that the truth, delivered calmly, travels farther than anger shouted loudly." Historians would later point to that Senate hearing as a pivotal moment, not just for Jasmine Crockett's career, but for the tone of American politics itself. At a time when outrage dominated discourse, a single hearing had reminded the nation that composure could be revolutionary. Clips of her exchanges with McConnell circulated online for months, amassing millions of views. Law students analyzed her testimony in constitutional law seminars. Journalists compared her performance to those of Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, lawyers who had mastered the art of persuasion through patience. McConnell, for his part, rarely spoke of the event again. Yet every time a new nominee appeared before the Senate, young aides whispered about the Crockett standard, a phrase meaning be ready for anything, and stay calm while doing it. One rainy evening nearly a year later, Jasmine Crockett returned to the Senate chamber to testify on new voting rights legislation. As she entered, she caught sight of McConnell seated near the back. Their eyes met briefly. He nodded once in acknowledgement. She returned the gesture and took her seat at the witness table. When the hearing ended, McConnell approached quietly. "Madam Assistant Attorney General," he said, extending his hand. "You've done well." "Thank you, Senator," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. "So have you, keeping me sharp." For a brief second, they shared the smallest trace of mutual respect. Then they turned away, two adversaries bound by the same institution, each understanding that democracy's strength lies not in victory, but in endurance. As Crockett left the chamber, reporters shouted questions, flashes burst, and her aide whispered, "They're already calling this the calm before the next storm." Crockett smiled faintly. "Then we'd better be ready," she said. "Because storms don't scare me, they remind me why I'm here." Outside, thunder rolled above the Capitol dome, and beneath its echo, the newest guardian of civil rights walked into the rain, steady and unshaken, proof that composure, wielded with truth, could still move the nation.